Welcome to the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies here at Johns Hopkins University. I'm Kent Calder, the director of the Reischauer Center and also vice dean for academic affairs here at Johns Hopkins University SAIS. Today we have a very timely topic, and I do promise that we will also link it to today's momentous events in Eastern Europe with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. But of course, it deals with a topic of much broader long-term importance, particularly for those of us interested in Pacific affairs. Our subject is 70 years strong, the US-Japan alliance and implications for Asian diplomacy. We have a distinguished group of specialists who are participating. We start with a message from Professor Makoto Iokibe, the former director of the National Defense Academy of Japan. Then we'll have comments by Professor Tosh Minohara, who is a distinguished specialist at Kobe University and also the director of the Institute of Indo-Pacific Affairs there. And then following him, we'll have as a major panelist, Ambassador David Shear, whom I'm proud to say is also a senior fellow with the Reischauer Center here at SAIS, and also teaches courses on the US, Japan, Southeast Asia, and other topics here at SAIS. We, after their discussion, the three of us will have a panel together, and then we look forward very much to your questions. So please, we have a Q&A function. Please put in questions in the Q&A, any questions that relate to the talk that interest you, and we will do our best to deal with those. As I said, we have a tremendously important subject for today that focuses on two nations, the United States and Japan, which, as we all know, are the two largest free market economies in the world. They're also the most sophisticated high technology economies in the Pacific in areas such as electronics and telecommunications. And also they have been allies, most importantly, allies since the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951. Even though previous to that, of course, they were antagonists in the most cosmic war in world history. The world, of course, of the Pacific is very different from what it was in 1951. Professor Iokibe's edited book, in which Professor Minohara was also a major participant, is something that we certainly will reference, and Professor Iokibe will also give some comments about. But let me just briefly say that because I'm going to focus more on the present than on the history, but I think the contrast to 1951 is extremely important in understanding the dynamics of Pacific affairs that we have today. In 1951, when both the peace treaty and also the US-Japan alliance were signed in San Francisco, the US and Japan were alone as major powers in the Pacific. Korea was in the midst of the Korean War. China, mainland China, was under embargo. Southeast Asia was colonized. Today, of course, we have a much different and more complicated environment. China itself is massively larger and more important, both in economic and also in geopolitical terms. Korea has grown greatly. Southeast Asia is a group of independent and growing nations. And these sorts of issues have led to some of the important questions that we're going to be discussing, including the South China Sea, the future of Taiwan, and so on. I think it's important, though, also to realize that outside of the Pacific, the configuration of Eurasia, with which East Asia is so closely linked, has quietly been changing as well, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991. And of course, precisely that collapse is what has motivated Vladimir Putin now to try to recreate the Soviet Union, even by force. But the new world, which was created by the collapse of the Soviet Union, involved a vacuum, a geopolitical vacuum in the middle of Asia, a China that began reaching out to the West across the continent. And of course, Belt and Road has accelerated that. New relationships between Europe and Asia, particularly with China, including new relationships in Eastern Europe. And of course, now, as the Ukraine crisis unfolds, a major question is whether China, which has had relatively good relations with an independent Ukraine, is going to press in any way against Russia, which is engaged in a headlong invasion of the Ukraine that we will get back to. In conclusion, about the transformation and the backdrop to where we are now, I think it's important to note that the institutional structure of both Eurasia and also of the Pacific has changed profoundly. We have some institutions such as SITO, Southeast Asia Trade Organization, or CENTO that have collapsed. We have others like the United Nations, which have not been terribly effective, certainly not in security terms within Asia since the Korean War. We have a host of new institutions. We have the Asian Development Bank. We have the TPP, where Japan is playing such an important role. We have the RCEP trade agreement created just in the last year. And we also have the Quad, although certainly developments today in the Ukraine may cast into question the importance or perhaps the limited relevance of a configuration like that, as India, for example, has emphatically refused to criticize Russia despite the invasion. And India, of course, has strong ties to Russia as well. Now, in today's discussion, as I mentioned, because of the new configurations that exist in Asia, there are some very, very important issues that have arisen. We've talked about the South China Sea, certainly the relationship of Southeast Asia to the US and Japan, particularly as China becomes more powerful, is an important question. The Ukraine, what kind of implications will the Russian invasion of the Ukraine have? And what sorts of international institutions are useful or potentially useful in both coordinating sanctions and also perhaps restraining Russia in future? As I mentioned, the Quad clearly seems to be of questionable utility in this connection, although perhaps not in others, whereas the G7, which met virtually just a few hours ago, seems to becoming an increasingly important institution. Well, there are many, many issues outstanding here. We have two really outstanding scholars to speak. But before that, I personally, and I think all of us, look forward to hearing from Professor Iokibe, who has been a longtime friend over the years and a distinguished scholar. So we look forward to hearing from him.
I am Makoto Iokibe, editor of the book, The History of US-Japan Relations, and now Chancellor of University of Hyogo. Hi, Ken. Professor Calder. It has been so long, お懐かしいです. I remember the lively discussions we had at Harvard in 1978, almost half century ago. The book covers more than 160 years from the arrival of Commodore Perry in the mid-19th century to the 9/11 terrorist attack in the United States and onto Operation Tomodachi following the East Japan earthquake, as well as the second Abe administration. I would like to thank the 18 scholars that took part in research and writing, especially Professor Tosh Minohara from Kobe University, who contributed greatly as co-editor of the English version, and who is participating in today's webinar as a panelist on my behalf. As highlighted in this book, US-Japan relations prior to the World War II were formulated by layers of cooperation and rivalry, leading to the tragic Pacific War. How the peoples of the United States and Japan were able to not just put down their weapons and rebuild cordial relations, but to maintain and strengthen this alliance is truly a triumph of bilateral relations. This is not only a symbol of friendship nurtured over 75 years, but an international public asset that has supported the peace and order of the Asia Pacific for so long. However, after the end of the Cold War, North Korea and the rapid military expansion of China have acted as great obstacles to the stability of the region. I believe this is where the true value of the US-Japan alliance must be demonstrated. Now, Prime Minister Kishida is driving Japan's diplomacy, inviting the next Quad summit to be held in Japan. The US has also recently appointed Ambassador Rahm Emanuel to Tokyo and held Biden-Kishida virtual summit, which signaled that strengthening the US-Japan relationship will be a key theme. I hope today's seminar will not only be a review of our nation's long history together, but also a platform which we can think of ways that the alliance can evolve to support the stability of the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you very much and have an exciting time.
Well, thank you very much, Makoto. It's a real pleasure to hear from you. And as our next speaker, we're also honored to have your successor at Kobe University, another distinguished scholar, Dr. Tosh Minohara. Professor Minohara, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you again for the kind introduction, Dr. Calder. Good morning from Japan. It is a real honor to be part of the session today. Professor Iokibe, in his opening, led off with how to strengthen, how to evolve the US-Japan alliance. And I think the events in Ukraine have really shown us the importance of having an alliance, especially with the United States. Had Ukraine been part of NATO or had some kind of formal agreement with the United States, perhaps this outcome would have been different. Putin would have had to overcome a much larger hurdle to try to accomplish his aim of annexing Ukraine. So I think the Japanese should be very grateful for this alliance and not take it for granted. In my limited time that I have in my opening, I'd like to touch upon three things that I like to suggest as ways to or means to strengthen the alliance. Now, as an aside, I just like to commend the Japanese government for taking the first baby steps in opening up Japan to foreign students. I personally lost 5 students to the pandemic. By lost, I mean they had a scholarship. They were planning to come to Japan. In the end, they could not come, and so they decided to go to Korea instead. And I think this is a tremendous loss from the perspective of Japanese soft power. Allowing 5,000 foreign students a day is, in my mind, falling short of what Japan should do. But it is, I think, an important step in the right direction when it comes to Japan engaging the world in a meaningful manner, which also includes the United States. Now, my 3 main points. One is that concerning what's happening in Ukraine, I believe that Japan should act in lockstep with the United States, really support American leadership. What I see now is Japan sort of pausing. I mean, it's acting, but it's waiting to see how the United States and Europe acts, and then sort of it's reacting. And I like to see a Japan that is more proactive. I mean, it doesn't have to go beyond what the United States is doing, but I think it'd be better if there's no pause, that there's this, Japan is seen as part of this scrum with the United States. And so, and it really goes back to the days of Koizumi. I really miss Koizumi in that he was very un-Japanese in the way that he really showed leadership. I mean, Japan was visible. And, Ukraine is perhaps a European event, but in the day and the age where we're all connected, I think that's not the mentality we should have. So I like to see Japan more in the forefront. It should be seen as an incremental. Japan does not have the luxury like Brazil in being lukewarm, or in South Korea in being a little reserved. I think Japan, as a G7 power, should be out in the front alongside the United States. Secondly, this sort of really relates to what I just said, but it's Japan needs to finally change its security identity. Many in Japan still, look back at the cosmic war that Dr. Calder said in his introduction. But I think the world has really moved on. The world is not afraid of a militarized Japan. The world is afraid of Japan that does not act, that does not stand up to defend freedom and democracy. So this is what I refer to Japan's changing its security identity. And I think an important factor of this is Japan revising its constitution. Of course, there are a lot of experts that say, no, the constitution doesn't need to be revised. You don't need to spend political capital there because Japan can change its security laws and whatnot. But I think that it's the constitution that really changes your identity as a nation, as who you are as a people. And the security law revisions really do not resonate within the general public. And therefore, I think you can't shortcut this process of revising the constitution. And it's something that Japan really needs to do. Another thing that sort of relates to this is that I think it's about time that Japan sort of discards or jettisons its middle power mentality. Japan is not an Australia, not a Canada. When you look at Japan's GDP population, it is still the third largest economy in the world. It has to start acting like that. I mean, Japan has this mentality that it's a power hitter, but it believes that it's just going to go. It doesn't need to hit home runs. But I think Japan really does need to make an impact in this regard. And so when I say changing Japan's security identity, it means Japan becoming a security provider, which the Constitution does not allow. And by security provider, I'm not saying that Japan send troops to the Middle East or other parts of the world, but at least to maintain the security of the region in which it resides. And of course, this would include Taiwan. As it stands now, if there is some kind of contingency in Taiwan, Japan would probably support Taiwan through, will give lots of moral support, perhaps logistical support, and definitely, will help finance this, defensive war for Taiwan. But that's not enough. And Japan has to stop this mentality of being a security receiver and start becoming a security provider. It's really interesting how, after the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was referred to as the Prussia in the East, and this meant a militaristic, aggressive, dangerous Japan. But what Japan needs to really keep in mind now is that it should not become the Germany in the East. And that is, sending 5,000 helmets, taking a lukewarm position on Ukraine is not an option for Japan. And so, I think I'd like to see a more forceful Japan. The Japanese presence needs to be expanded. And finally, and then perhaps this is the most important thing, and being in Japan, I lived in Japan for the past 20 plus years, and I think that Japan needs to remain relevant. And I think if you live in Tokyo or the other Japanese major metropolises, you don't really see this. But when you go to the countryside of Japan, the countryside is being depopulated. The Japanese population is shrinking at an enormous rate. And not only is it shrinking, it's aging at an enormous rate. And this is not good. It's not the population per se that's important, and it's of course the composition, but these things are not really good for Japan. So I think Japan needs to really seriously think about having an immigration policy for the first time in its history to remain relevant, because after all, the US-Japan alliance doesn't mean much if Japan is not worth protecting, if it's just, a minor power that's no longer important for its perspective of U.S. national interests. And finally, I know I've gone over my 7 minutes, but I think what happens in Ukraine may have implications in the Indo-Pacific. When you look back to World War II, the war first started in Europe with Hitler's invasion of Poland, but Japan was watching the events in Europe transpire. And once it realized this was their moment, this was an opportunity, Japan moved. In a similar fashion, if Putin's blitzkrieg succeeds, is able to change the status quo, then perhaps China may think, okay, this is our moment. This can be done. The United States won't be standing up for countries that are not in a formal alliance. So yes, there's definite connection. It probably is not going to happen this year, but there's going to be a time lag, definitely. And China will not do Russia's bidding. But if they believe that it serves in their national interest, then they will act with Putin. And of course, Xi Jinping said that this relationship has no limits. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. So thank you again, and I'd like to allow the next speaker to give his points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tosh. There's a lot of important issues, certainly, that you've raised there, particularly the broader implications of the Ukraine crisis for the Pacific and whether Japan can continue to be a middle power. Now, as our next speaker, we have someone who certainly can speak definitively about American policy. Ambassador David Shear is a senior fellow here at the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies. He served as principal deputy under Secretary of State for Policy in 2016 and 17. He was also Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. after a 32-year career in the State Department that included the ambassadorship to Vietnam, but also considerable work on China as Director of Chinese Affairs and Deputy Assistant Secretary dealing with China as well. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Dave, and we look forward to your thoughts.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Kent, and thanks to everybody for giving me the opportunity to join you tonight. First of all, congratulations to Professor Iokibe and Professor Minohara for publishing this fine book on the history of US-Japan relations. It's a comprehensive and very thorough narrative of the history of our relationship, and I certainly will refer to it frequently in the future for background. I myself feel like I've lived through several chapters of the book, and I'll get to that point in a moment. But first, with regard to Ukraine, I agree fully with Professor Minohara. I would like to see Japan in lockstep with the United States, the G7, and its NATO allies on condemning Russian actions and sanctioning Ukraine. I was encouraged by Prime Minister Kishida's condemnation of Russia in the Diet today. I'm encouraged with his expression of solidarity with the G7, and I certainly hope that Japan implements all of the sanctions that the G7 plans to implement, as described by the president in his remarks today. That certainly will demonstrate Japan's commitment to a strong Eurasian policy in support of the United States and its other allies. With regard to my living through several chapters of the book, I joined the Foreign Service in 1982, and I've served about 12 years of my 32 to 34-year career in U.S. government on U.S.-Japan relations, many of those years in our embassy in Tokyo. And I can tell everybody along the lines that Professor Minohara described, that my goal throughout my career has been to promote the evolution of a much stronger, you might say more normal US-Japan alliance. The United States and Japanese militaries need to plan, train, and operate together much more closely for all of the contingencies that may arise in the Western Pacific, including a Korean and Taiwan contingencies, and the US should be cooperating much more closely together in the increasingly important Southeast Asian region as well. So I worked steadily with my Japanese colleagues throughout my career to make a fully evolved US-Japan alliance a reality, and I'm delighted to see the evolution that's taken place just over the past few years, particularly since Prime Minister Abe achieved the prime ministership in 2012. I think the progress has been extraordinary. I think we need a lot more progress. I was encouraged by Prime Minister Suga's mention of Taiwan in his remarks during his first meeting with President Biden. And we've got a lot more work to do to ensure that aggression, that we can effectively deter aggression across the Taiwan Strait. We also need to work, as I mentioned earlier, we need to work together much more closely on Southeast Asia. And I think also in line with Professor Minohara's remarks, it's clear that Japan has had a long history of deep economic and more recently political engagement in Southeast Asia. I'd like to see more Japanese military engagement in Southeast Asia. Northeast Asia is vitally important to both Japan and the United States, but it's a theater that's pretty stable and pretty locked in terms of what opportunities there are. But Southeast Asia presents a huge field of opportunities for both Japan and the United States to compete effectively with China. And I hope that as the Biden administration implements its new Indo-Pacific strategy, that they indeed devote adequate resources to the task of competing with China throughout the region and in Southeast Asia, and in encouraging Japan to take a leadership role, in Southeast Asia that I think it's earned through its long and deep economic engagement with the region. More recently, in its demonstration of leadership in saving the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've seen increased Japanese efforts at military and Coast Guard capacity building in Southeast Asia. We've seen increased maritime self-defense force deployments to the region. We'd like to see more of that, of course, and greater cooperation through the Quad with our Australian and Indian friends. Why don't I stop there?
Thanks very much, Dave. A lot out there. And one thing that I guess is, and Professor Minohara, we also look forward to a discussion of the three of us here. And I must say, I've been fascinated by both your comments, and Professor Minohara, we also look forward to you. Yes, good. To having a discussion, particularly of some of the issues that both of you raised regarding the implications of the situation that we have now in the Ukraine. And maybe to start that out, to follow along the lines of what I thought might be the implications of Professor Minohara, that the Ukraine is going to have echo effects across the continent, and it's going to intensify potentially tensions in the East China Sea relating to Taiwan and so on. What sort of a relationship, Tosh, do you see between those two developments, and how can we neutralize the potential shock effects across the continent of the situation in the Ukraine?
All right, thank you very much for your excellent question. I guess a lot depends on things that we don't know yet, and I guess one of the things that we don't know is how large is Putin's ambitions. I mean, where will he stop? Is it a matter of just taking Ukraine, or does it go back? Does it go as far as recreating the Soviet Union, which would involve the Baltic states and other regions? And so that's one thing that we still don't have an answer. Another thing that I would also consider important is how successful will Putin be in his endeavor? He probably wants this to be quick. I think it has to be a blitzkrieg, because if it's a protracted war and it doesn't appear very successful, then China will have no incentive to bandwagon with Russia. And so, and I do believe that it's in Putin's advantage to have China open a second front. So if I were Putin, I would say, China, why don't you do something in the Indo-Pacific? And this would really relieve the pressure off of what Putin is doing in Europe. So, and in that regards, I don't think they're directly connected at this moment. But as things transpire in Europe, there could be definite implications to the Indo-Pacific. And China, again, has its grievances. That's very similar with Russia. They believe that they've been mistreated historically, that things have been very unfair towards them. And plus, just as Putin sees Ukraine as being part of Russia, China believes that Taiwan is part of China. And so, and I believe that one of the things I think that we tend to overlook or not understand correctly is the minds of dictators. And that's very hard to do because we're ordinary people and we don't think like dictators, but I think their ambition and then striving for greatness is just tremendous. And
well, you're focusing very much on Putin himself, and you're suggesting that which certainly is a crucial issue. The additional question that I would have, and I suspect maybe several of our audience, is what are the shock effects going to be and how do we reduce them? You were talking about a more proactive Japan in particular. Now, and exactly as you say, it's not a direct relationship, but of course, there could be a danger that if Putin succeeds rather smoothly, that Xi Jinping could see that and decide, well, maybe this is the time to move. What about that? Don't you worry about that kind of thing and what should be done?
Yeah, I totally worried. And I think what needs to be done is some sort of security assurance to Taiwan. Again, I think had Ukraine been part of NATO, I think Putin would have thought more about his actions. And because they weren't a part of NATO, it made it easier for him to pursue his ambitions. And so, and of course, this is the delicate sword. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, does giving security assurances to Taiwan, does that provoke China?
Okay, you're asking very interesting questions. Dave, I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you see shock effects across the continent, and what should Japan and the US do?
Well, I think the Russo-Chinese cooperation, diplomatic cooperation in connection with Putin's moves demonstrates the continued salience of the strategic triangle in Eurasia among Tokyo, Moscow, and Washington. The strategic shoe is on the other foot now, 50 years after President Nixon's visit to Beijing. But I think we need to be clear about how the Sino-Russian relationship works. There continues to be deep distrust between the two of them. Putin needs China more than the Chinese need Putin, I think, right now. It's clear that Putin needed the Sino-Russian declaration of February 4 as a source of legitimacy. He needs Chinese cooperation on sanctions evasion, which I suspect the Chinese will give, even if they do so quietly. And he needed Chinese support in opposing NATO expansion. It's clear, though, that the Chinese had the upper hand in the talks. Chinese got specific mention of Taiwan from the Russians. The Russians did not get specific mention of Ukraine in the document. Wang Li mentioned Ukraine in subsequent remarks, but that sounds like some Chinese tossed Russians to reassure them that they're not completely off the rails by not including mention of Ukraine in the statement.
Well,
with regard to
please, yeah, go ahead.
With regard to its application in East Asia, we need to be extremely vigilant about the prospects for increased Sino-Russian cooperation in the Western Pacific. We need to be extremely vigilant on the prospects for some sort of Chinese move in the region, particularly with regard to Taiwan. On a explicit security commitment to Taiwan, I'm not so sure. I think dual deterrence across the Taiwan Strait has worked well. I think it offers to continue working well, but to do that, what we need is less of an explicit assurance to Taiwan than increased US-Japan cooperation in strengthening deterrent capabilities. And I think everybody understands, on the basis of our arms sales to Taiwan, on the basis of the Taiwan Relations Act, and on the basis of all of our behavior over the past few decades, that the Chinese would have to consider very strongly the risk of American intervention in a situation across the Taiwan Strait.
I was listening yesterday evening to Win Lord talking about some of these things. And what he was suggesting was that strategic ambiguity, of course, he was involved in the creation of strategic ambiguity with the Shanghai communique and so on, but that he thought that had sort of borne the test of time, continued to be relevant. And then he also pointed to the fact that Xi Jinping faces the National People's Congress and the question of his extension of his term as leader of China. this fall. And so he wouldn't want to take risks. So at the short run, in the short run, the danger is perhaps less than we might suppose.
I was in that event last night. I was watching that.
You
event
heard
last
that
night.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Winston also said that he's afraid an open-ended defense commitment to Taiwan might encourage a Taiwan leader less cautious than Tsai Ing-wen to do something reckless. And I agree with that. And I think the current situation, dual deterrence, is the solution to that problem.
I see. Tosh, I don't know whether you agree with that. Japan, of course, is in a different position. It's not across the ocean. It's right next to Taiwan.
Absolutely. You read my mind. Yes, I think there are different ramifications for Japan. If China does annex Taiwan, it will definitely militarize, and it will really change the realities on the ground for Japan's southwestern flank. So this is the U2s.
Apropos of exactly that, I have a question to ask you just really briefly, and then Dave, perhaps the same thing. One thing that some people say, well, the US has had a tendency to be drawn away from Pacific affairs time after time by some sort of a crisis elsewhere in the world. Back in 1949, of course, it was the crisis that created NATO itself. Then for many, many years, we had all these Middle East crises that kept drawing us there. And many American policymakers were Pacific policymakers firmly determined that the issues were really in the Pacific, rising China and so on. And of course, the Biden administration has stressed exactly that. Now, do you worry, Tosh, that the Ukraine is going to draw the US back to European diplomacy and it's going to forget about the challenges in the Pacific? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I don't believe that's the case. I believe the United States, as as a superpower, is capable of looking at 2 or 3 places at the same time, perhaps not engaging them simultaneously, but will definitely be aware. And the fact that we have experts such as Ambassador Shear and yourself that are very, very engaged with this region, I think will play a huge role in preventing the United States from just focusing on one region of the world. So no, I think that's not.
Well, that's good.
Worry.
Good
But my
to hear.
worry, can I say what my worry is?
Sure.
So before the invasion of Ukraine, I was really concerned with what was happening. I spoke with several friends, from my high school, from my old high school friends and whatnot, and these people are not, they're ordinary Americans, and they're not Trump supporters at all. But what they told me was, who cares about Ukraine? We're no longer as strong. We just got to deal with ourselves. There's so many problems domestically, the divisions. And so it's time we stop worrying about the world and just focus on ourselves. And it wasn't just one person, it was several people. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so it's this sort of, we see this in American history, this looking inwards, this moment. And this is what I think Japan needs to be very cautious about. And I think Japan's role is to bring the United States so that it remains engaged in this region, that it does not give the United States the option to just look inwards and say, oh, who cares about what happens? And when you look at World War I, World War II, the United States was slow to react. But in the end, it did get involved. And I think that was due to miscalculation on part of, first of all, Kaiser's Germany and also Japan with Pearl Harbor. But if Putin is learning from history, he'll probably want to do this in a way that does not drag the United States in.
Well, that's striking. It's parallel to what the British, of course, Churchill was always worried about that, about bringing the Americans in. Dave, what about you? Is there a likelihood that because of this NATO crisis or this Ukraine crisis that we'll see the pendulum shift back very much to an Atlanticist orientation and the Pacific will get the back seat?
Well, I spent my career worrying that senior American leaders were not spending enough attention on East Asia and the Western Pacific. And I continue to worry that. However, as Tosh suggested, the US can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think the Biden administration has demonstrated that in sending Secretary of State Blinken to the region in the midst of the Ukraine crisis and in issuing the Indo-Pacific strategy in the midst of the same crisis. I don't doubt the administration's commitment to pay more attention to East Asia. The key from here on in will be doing what we say we're going to do and devoting the resources necessary for us to pursue that Indo-Pacific declaratory strategy effectively. And that will mean more diplomatic resources. It'll mean more development assistance and infrastructure financing resources. It'll mean stronger military posture in the region, as well as cooperation with our allies and partners. The Indo-Pacific strategy made a point of stressing the importance of that cooperation, and I think the Biden administration has actually done very well in that regard so far. But the key will be, can they devote the resources necessary to pursue the policy they say they're pursuing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a resource issue, no doubt. Well, that's a question of American policy. We have in the chat, if I might, this might be a good point of transition. We've had several interesting questions coming in from our audience. And the first one, perhaps, to Professor Minohara. It has to do with the mindset change in Japan. And this that you sort of alluded to, you suggested that that was necessary. And this questioner agrees with you, but just asks how this might be done.
Yeah, that's a very, very valid question. Teaching in Japan for over 20 years, it's really interesting how devoid the military is from anything in the curriculum. I mean, if I were to teach about, in 2000, when I brought a Japanese JGSDF Army officer and had him lecture, I got in really hot water. I mean, and it was, to me, I couldn't understand what's wrong with having an officer talk about the security situation. And of course, because he knows he's an expert. And to this day, it's very difficult to do that. Military, nothing is taught about the military in Japanese universities, except for the National Defense Academy, which is technically not a university. So yes, I think it goes through education. That's the reason why I launched my nonprofit, because I think the Japanese should be more aware about the security realities. But still, I mean, when you talk to the average Japanese, they're like, security, there's nothing to do with us. There's this really false sense of security in Japan, and it might have to do with the fact that Japanese society is very peaceful and very safe, right? You can have your wallet half sticking out and you're not going to get mugged or anything. And perhaps that's reflected on how Japan views the international community at large. So, but it's going to take time. Maybe I'm hoping that there'll be some kind of shock effect, and maybe Ukraine will be one of these, where the Japanese realize, we need to do more for our defense. We can't just rely, an alliance is important, but we got to do more from the perspective of what we can do. And that I think goes along with one of the questions that was on the chat about Japan spending more on defense expenditures. I mean, going over 1% should not be a target. And by the way, there's no rule saying that Japan can't go over. Mm-hmm. But having a certain figure should not be the target. It's like if Japan does more, then naturally you'll go over, right? So, but I guess the big question is, well, where does Japan have the money? Its economy is shrinking. It's been deflationary spiral for the past 30 years, and this pandemic has been very, very expensive. So I mean, if you have a limited wallet, I mean, what do you do? But of course, Japan can't be stingy when it comes to its own defense.
Thank you. Well, was a parallel question actually that was just asked about the United States, and perhaps Dave, I'm sure you would have insights into this. And it was how, of course, the U.S. is global, exactly as we know so well. but it's got interests in Asia, it's got interests in Europe that it has to respond to. And now with Russia and China coordinating, it maybe has a more difficult job in that regard than previously. So how should it balance? How should the United States balance its commitment of resources of various kinds to Europe and Asia?
This is not a new problem for the United States. We've faced it since the end of World War II. And I recall that during the Korean War, we had problems, and the Vietnam War as well. There were people who believed that we weren't placing adequate priority on Europe, and we were engaged too heavily in peripheral theaters. East Asia certainly is no longer a peripheral theater. And I think that in addition to focusing more senior level attention on the region and devoting more resources to the region, as the Indo-Pacific strategy suggests, we have to not only work more closely with our allies, but we need to rely on them more. They need to be stepping up and filling what gaps they see in American capabilities and resources.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I think Prime Minister Abe demonstrated that quite adroitly in his approach to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think Japan will need to keep up that level of leadership, that level of engagement and determination indefinitely into the future.
Now, exactly on that point, one person was asking, they noted that both Abe and, Nakasone and Abe had broken the 1% cap on defense spending, but then it had fallen back. It's sort of gone above that and fallen back. And given this new environment, when will Japanese defense spending reach 2% of GDP? I don't know if anyone wants to deal with that, or
Well, I think I already touched on that during my earlier remarks.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Now, another question that several people had to do, of course, with the Ukraine situation itself. It was kind of from where do we go from here? And maybe I could add a little bit into that. We saw in President Biden's comments today, for example, sanctions against major Russian banks and some technology constraints. Conspicuously, we didn't see Russia taking Russia off of the SWIFT payments clearing system, for example. And we didn't see sanctions against Putin or close associates personally. I mean, those are just two. But my question really would be, what about that? What's the next step, or what is there? Are there areas that, well, Japan, I think it should be noted, Japan certainly participated. Japan was involved in the G7 meetings. Japan took some financial sanctions and so on. But what about the next step? Are the sanctions that we have enough? Are there things like, for example, questions about successor regimes or recognition of what's happened diplomatically and so on? These may really be future steps, but given that the overwhelming force that's being applied now, there's a good possibility that this government might either fall or become an exile regime of some sort. You know, what should we all be doing or thinking about as sort of next steps as this crisis emerges?
Well,
Yes,
I don't think the Biden administration is finished sanctioning the Russians. I think they have other sanctions options up their sleeve, and I suspect they're waiting for the right opportunity to use them, whether that's implementation of a SWIFT related sanction. I don't know. I'm not a financial expert, and I'm not entirely certain what the global financial implications of doing that would be. But I have no doubt that the administration has other sanctions up its sleeve. We've already seen that sanctions failed to prevent the Russians from invading the Ukraine, but those sanctions can be I think, can be very useful in negotiating a eventual Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. Hopefully the administration's thinking in the same way.
Sure. Tosh, would you like to add anything on that?
Well, I was actually hoping this morning when I'd wait, after I woke up and then checked the news, that would be part of Biden's sanctions, that the Russians would be excluded from SWIFT. And after all, it's called SWIFT, so you'd hope that he would act swiftly, but that didn't happen. So that, to me, was my disappointment. Going back to Japan, my sort of worry is that the Japanese government may think that pushing too hard on Russia will have ramifications to the Northern Territories, because there's this lack of realism in certain circles in Japan that the Russians will negotiate the return of the Northern Territories, which I don't see that happening, because what would Putin have to gain by returning these islands? So if there are reservations about pushing Russia too hard because of the Northern Territories, that I think is a big mistake. And Japan should not even think about that and deal with the situation that's before them. With strategic or the security ambiguity that we talked about, one of the things that I worry about is that in being ambiguous in your position towards, in this case, China, perhaps is the right course to take, but you can't be ambiguous as to your own policy. So if China crosses a red line, you have to sort of know what you're going to do. And this is worrisome because this will depend on who is president. And I think one of the comments that was in the chat box talked about the possibility of Trump returning to the presidency in 2024. And that would be pretty scary. And that's maybe something that Putin is hoping for as well. When it comes to like the Senkakus, the United States is very clear that it's part of the US-Japan alliance, Article 5. But when I hear such statements, it makes me think, okay, the United States will not defend the Senkakus, that it's a bluff, because no American would support protecting these islands in which the Japanese themselves are not protecting, right? And so you got to convince the American public opinion for the United States to act. So, it has to go beyond more than declarations or statements. And what's important is the United States does not really shift policy from each administration, that there has to be some kind of consistency. And that seems to be very difficult to do in this divided political climate.
Well, I have to apologize to some of our audience. We've had a lot of really interesting questions. I wish that we had more time to discuss on issues, for example, of how the US-Japan-Korea relationship might evolve. And a rather unsettling question to me, it's quite a real one. We may not have an answer, but is this irredentism on the part of Putin of, just deciding that the Ukraine belongs to him and then invading it, using military force to invade, is this going to encourage new claims on lost territories? And perhaps a movement into a more volatile and unsettling sort of world than we've seen in the past. I think we have to leave that question as a rhetorical, unsettling one for our for future discussion. Let me just say, I do have to say, sort of in closing, that both of us, I think all three of us share a deep feeling from our experience over the years in the importance of US-Japan dialogue and of US-Japan cooperation in facing the volatile world that we face. And so and also I think we probably also agree that to have someone in leadership in both countries, actually, we have people with quite a bit of diplomatic experience, President Biden, but also, of course, Prime Minister Kishida was foreign minister for many years, and a sensitivity to diplomacy and its importance in the kind of volatile world that we have today is absolutely crucial. So I wish that we had more time. This is a discussion I think all of us agree to be continued. Thank you to both of you, of course. Thank you to our audience as well. And it's a real pleasure to have everyone here. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.